All right, we're back. It is COMP3025 in the winter 2017 semester here at Georgian, and we are week 3, part 2 of our broadcast, mobile and pervasive computing. I have to point out that there is a Lab 1 assignment that I put up. It's worth 2% of your final grade. This is where I want you to put up your screenshot and your GitHub link. Now, this is due by the end of day today, so it's due by midnight, right? So again, it'll give you a chance to, I can't believe we're already at January 25th. It'll give you a chance to put stuff together, and any kind of suggestions I made, maybe you want to take some of that and put it there and change that, because that's going to be your user interface for your assignment that you have to build for next week. As a reminder, remember that next week, this is due on the Tuesday night. It's not due on the Wednesday. So it's not due during class time. It's due the night before, first. So please try and get it done by then. It's 20% late for every day that you're late. That would be a bad outcome. So you don't want to have that. I mean, I'm going to talk about a little bit today about kind of strategies on how to get things done and my recommendations, and also how we can use assignment 1 as a great bonus assignment. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second, right? So again, Lab 1, please get it done. It's due by the end of the day. For people who are watching remotely, you can certainly submit by the end of the day. It doesn't matter to me. And if you haven't started for whatever reason, and I've talked to a couple people who have some difficulty starting, or they couldn't get it done, or it was their first day today or whatever, that's totally fine. Just try and get it'd be a big loss. 2% of your final grade is like, it's huge, right? So I don't understand why you wouldn't get it done for a bonus, right? So please try and get that out. Okay, one more thing. Now I want to talk about calculators in general. And if I kind of put up my calculator that I have here, so if I was going to search for my calculator app on the Mac, I'm just going to kind of bring this up here. Before we get back into Ionic for a second, I always want you to think about this. Notice how we have a reference we can work with. So we've done our user interface, and now you're going to be starting to work on the logic for next week, right? One of the challenges when we work on logic is that we think it's easy, but then it ends up being quite complex. Here's some of the complexities. Notice when I click the 1 button, or any button, that the 0 turns into a 1. If I click the C button, it goes back to a 0. I mean, this is basic functionality, but I'm telling you, people miss this kind of stuff, right? Now, notice this would be where the calculator has been reset, right? So there is a different state. I'm going to call it a state within air quotes here, because we're moving from the reset state back to I'm using it state, right? I'm actually doing some calculation. Why am I telling you this? Because when I go from reset state to clicking in a number or touching a number, right, now it changes to 1. It replaces the first time. But now I don't replace, I add. It adds on, right? So there's a state change. I've gone from reset state to kind of a new state, if you think about it this way, right? As I type stuff in, if I press, example, if I go 1 plus 1, one thing I noticed when I did this exercise before, and if I press equals, some people give me a 2.0. Is that correct? No, right? If I haven't put in if I give you an integer, it's 2 integers, I should get an integer back, right? That's the next, I'll take marks off for that kind of stuff, because I want your calculator to function the same way, right? It should be a calculator app. And please if your calculator fails to calculate something like 1 plus 1 is equal to, like I said, 2.015 or something crazy like that, that's a fail for that functionality. Plus is done, right? So, I would thoroughly test your stuff. I'm also going to break it. I'm also going to try and break your app. I want to take 2 and divide it by 0. What does it give me when I divide by 0, right? I want you to think about this, because you should be able to divide by 0, check it out. And what happens when I put a large number in here? What happens to my calculator? Take a look. This is what it does. Is this correct? Is it going to be usable on a mobile device at this point, right? Just saying. And look how it converts my 1s to 0s. I'm putting it out there because I want you to understand, even on a, this is the app, the calculator app that comes with iOS. Did you start pressing 0? No. Did you see me press 0? Here, let's try it again. Watch. So here's my thing, and if I go 1, a bunch of 1s, notice it starts making the text smaller. That's their way of doing it. But there's going to come a time where it converts my 1s to 0s. Why? Well, I'm starting to. It's not infinity. What I'm starting to do is surpass the size of my integer value, right? So my integers can only be so big, and then when it goes beyond that, it's going to start producing 0s, because it's going to try and estimate. Remember, computers are only limited by how many, how big we make our integers. Even an unsigned int like this has a limitation in terms of how we display it, how we store the data, right? Now this is an unreasonable large number, right? On a regular calculator, it would start giving you some weird numbers. It wouldn't allow you to do this, right? So to fix this problem, I want you to think of it this way, just to make it easy for us. If I do a number like ones that spans this much space, making it one size smaller is okay. But once you go beyond that, I want you to consider making me stop entering digits. That might be the simpler way, right? Nines are bigger than ones because they take up more space, see? So think about when I put nines, I have less space. And so I would test my app with a bunch of nines when it comes to the width that I would have, right? This is just logical stuff to enter data. And if I add additional functionalities, like what does my percent do? If I do 8 and then I go percent, right? But then there's another function, right? If I go, if I do something like, so here I'm going to say 10, plus, 8% equals to 10.8, right? Is that right? 8% of 10 is 0.8. Right? What's 8% of 10? Is it 0.8? No, right? Huh? Is it? Well, what's 10% of 10? 1. 10% of 10 is 1, right? So what's 8% of 10? Huh? Well, I'm saying, think about what this just did. Did it calculate things properly? So 10% of 10, right? 100% of 10 is 10. 10% of 10 is 1, right? 1% of 10 is, 0.1, right? 1% of 10. I'm looking at 8% of 10, so it's 0.8. So it's correct, right? 8% of 10. 8% of 10. I said, right? So that's what I'm saying. When I go 10, okay, let's try it this way. So 100, right, to make it easier, plus 8% equals to 108, right? Same thing. 10 plus 8% is 10.8, right? So that's how it works. It actually does the percentages for you and actually adds it back on. So you might think the percentage calculator is actually easy, but it does some interesting functionality that you might be tricked for how it works. What about if you can, and again, calculator does a couple things, but there's also the ability for me to, with the calculator, do all this. I don't expect any of this stuff to happen. Especially if I want to kind of use the scientific version. So the calculator comes actually with a scientific version where it adds a bunch of different functions, right? Example, the easy ones would be, I'm just putting it out there. So again, I'm clicking C and I click P, the pi function. Is that a function, pi? Well, yeah, because these are easy to get marks for, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm kind of holding the value of 3.14159, and so on, right? So that's not a bad little function to do for extra 2 points. Why am I telling you all this? Because for every button that you add, I'm going to give you 2 points, right? Every button, right? That means that there's an opportunity for you to get a bunch of points for this app as bonus. Why am I giving you these bonus opportunities, right? Because when it comes down to more complex apps, I'm going to be a little harder, right, on marking and everything else. It gives you an opportunity to kind of put your functionality together. Don't go too crazy. Like don't spend hours and hours on this thing. There's going to be a threshold where you can't go beyond a certain bonus point value, right? So then, putting it out there. So I can't give you double the marks. It's not going to happen, right? But you can put it a bunch in there. There is a threshold, yeah, for sure. And if I go to things like cosine and sine and so on in brackets, like brackets to me, you got to think about what this functionality means. If I go, bracket 7 plus 8 and then bracket 15. Did I see the brackets here? What do those brackets do? It separates, right? It does order of operations. You gotta be careful because I'm not seeing anything here and there's no feedback, right, for me. Memory functions, be careful with memory functions. They might seem easy again, but they might mess you up in terms of functionality. So what's the moral of this story? Check your calculator and make sure whatever it does, try and emulate that because that's your reference point. You have a reference app, right? And a lot of times we might have an app that we're trying to do something like example, my app is like a calculator, but it also does this, right? Make sure that it does what it's supposed to do, right? And that I can't break it. If I can break your app and make it crash, you're going to lose marks right there. right? If like any kind of crash, you'll just lose marks, right? The numbers are balanced on my calculator, and notice that when I go back to the type, so if I go back to a basic calculator, programmer calculator is kind of neat too. This is neat, right? I like the options that it gives you, right, in terms of doing this kind of stuff. Now, not all calculators allow you to do this. The Mac gives you a calculator like this. But if I go back to basic for a second, so here's your basic calculator. Notice that even the background over here is a gradient background, right? The calculator isn't totally boring, right? It's boring. It's a calculator, right? Come on, right? But it's at least they've kind of added a gradient background in here to make it less boring, right? When I click the buttons, you can see that the buttons are selected. You can see the last operation that is selected. That is something that they've done, at least from an operation perspective, from a feedback. They give user feedback, the last operation that was done, right? And the other thing I want to bring to light for you guys is, you know, some of the padding. Notice that there's a lot of padding here on the 0. You know, you don't want to make it so that it hugs the right side of the screen from a user interface perspective. But now let's go back to functionality. So here's my expectation. Am I going to make a function for each number separate? That makes no bloody sense to me, right? I should be able to use one function to handle all numbers and all operators, all right? Now, how do I do that, right? Remember, I want to be able to detect which button was being touched, right? On an Android device or an iOS device, I'm going to use the sender argument for the, you know, for the logic. When you make your event handler, I'm going to be using the sender argument. You can do that with iOS as well. But how do I do that for web devices? How can I decide on which button was pressed? And you know that because whatever the event target was, right? Yes? There is something for jQuery, but there's something for JavaScript, yeah. You were saying? There you go.
I was saying for like the jQuery,
you could get the ID of the button. That's another way to do it, but that's one way of detecting it. And you want to do that. All the buttons should have its own ID. If you're going to link into them somehow, they should have a way of hooking in. We talked about hooking into you know, buttons on an interface. But remember that I want to be able to detect what button I'm pressing. There's different ways of doing that. For example, each button has some kind of child text value, right? That right there you can test. What's the text value of the button? If the text value is a 9, show me a 9, right? Seriously, I mean, it's that simple, right? We can also use on iOS and Android different tags, and there's different tags that kind of into play as well to detect which button is being pressed. Okay. So I want you to think about this. How do I make one? I want one event handler to handle it all, right? You don't need multiple event handlers, right? Some people may want to, or may decide to split off their event handlers. They do one for operators, one set of buttons for the buttons, and one for other. And what are other? The dot. That's the decimal is another, right? And so is clear. That's another. And if a backspace, that's another, right? Those are other kinds of buttons. So what you could do is you can say something like this. It's into, you could have an ID, but you can also add additional classes, right? You kind of attach to the buttons, and the classes or values. There's also name on the website. You can put a name for the button, and the name could be other, or it could be operator, or it could be operand. Operand is the number, operator is the operation, other would be something else, dot, clear, or something. Some way of identifying what button you're pressing, what class of button it is, and then saying if case, you can do a switch case. You know, as I'm giving you some you know, ideas here. You know, switch case, if operator, then I want to do the operation. Case, if it's operand, then I want to do something else. Case, if it's other, then do something else. Now the challenge is if I have the dot, and when I enter the decimal, I only can enter it one time, like I talked about last time, right? So how do you fix that? You can, every time the decimal is pressed, you want to search to see that the decimal is not already there, right? If it's already there, you don't want to add another one. You don't want to disable that functionality once it's entered one time. The other thing is I want to keep track of my operands. There's different ways of doing that. If I have my operands, remember the operands are the actual buttons. So here's an operand, 1, that's an operand. Here's the operator, times, right? 2, that's the second operand. So I've got 2 operands that I just used and an operator. And I want to keep track of those 2 things because I want to do linked operations or chained operations. 1 plus 2 times 3 divided by 5. I should be able to do that with a calculator because that's what a calculator can do, right? And it should be accurate. So how do I do that? How do I keep track of all these operands in a row? And what are the calculations to do? Now, there's some strategies around that. An example of that would be I have two variables that I have from a class scope perspective, or the application scope that I have that are called operand 1 and operand 2. I'm being very simple here. And you can have another one that's called, there might be a switch or some kind of flag they use for what state is my calculator. Is my calculator cleared or not? Or is my calculator being used right now, or is it in non-use state? Like, I want to be able to move from to replace numbers when I clear. This is I'm not right. So whenever I press a button, like I said, it changes everything. Notice that my button text changes here too, from C, which is clear, right? And when I kind of hover over that, it's kind of, there's nothing to clear anymore, right? All clear, including memory, right? You want to watch that, right? We don't have any memory functions here. So clear, you can actually put the words clear in here and delete, DEL, if you wanted to delete stuff, if you wanted to have a delete function. Notice also that my 0 has a double key length, right? Sometimes from a user interface perspective, we push the dot over here and make the equal sign double key length, because equals is kind of the button we want to hit more often. The most common calculations, the most common operations, you want to make them bigger. Some people also make their operators bigger than their buttons. I've seen designs like that. And I also saw someone do a design with this where just to be different, where they colored this part a U. They made a U and then an I, like a UI. Like someone came up with that, like just as a different way of creating their buttons, right? So there's like two rows, U and I, UI. But I mean, anything that's different than a regular calculator is okay. Just make sure that it functions properly. All right, back to that. So I press 1 again, and I go dot 3, and if I go dot again, the dot doesn't work again. It gives me that error or some kind of feedback. I don't expect some kind of sound to come back at you, but it shouldn't allow you to put anything back. Notice even it flashes the button. Then any kind of button I'm touching, it does that, right? But it won't allow me to put the dot in there.
Will be activated for F, J, and student residence buildings.
Right.
Please act as if this were a real emergency and you're required to evacuate the building. Again, in a few minutes, the fire alarm system will be activated for F, J, and residence buildings. Please act as if this were a real
Sorry, I have to pause that where we're listening to the alert. It sounds very robotic. I don't know why they do that kind of thing. I don't understand. But anyways, maybe they just don't have anybody who has a radio voice they can put up over the PA. I don't know. So back to functionality here. So we talked about using some kind of shared event handler, right, for the buttons and the operators and every button on the interface here. That's one option. The other thing you may want to consider is a whole MVC framework where you have the logic in a separate file, then the logic for the user interface, right? If you're using Ionic, it kind of caters to that anyway, especially when you're using Ionic and Angular. If you're using something like Xamarin, and there are a few people, I'm delightfully surprised that have tried to use Xamarin instead of something else. It's kind of done for you. You kind of have the logic and your presentation is split anyway, so that's pretty cool. So I'm saying, but for other people, like people who are using jQuery mobile, you may want to think about putting your calculations in a different JavaScript file. It's better form, but that means you have to understand how to break your modules into different parts, right? I'll be looking at your calculator next week. When you come in, one of the things we're going to do is kind of talk about your calculator. I want to look at your code. I'm going to look at your comments. Please do not discount things like your comments. Those are worth 5 marks. Why would you lose 5 marks out of your? You're going to get all these bonus marks, and then you lose 5 marks from your comments. It makes no sense, right? Please make your comments are done. I'm going to mark you on those things. I want your student number somewhere inside in your comments, right? So please make sure your student number is there. I'm asking for it. And then the other section that you have, when you look at your assignment document is GitHub. If you just, give me one link to GitHub and you never update it again, or 2. So you did today your user interface, and the next time you did all your logic. I'm sorry, but that's really not right. You should be giving me every feature. Every time you add a feature to get to your app, you should be uploading to GitHub. I want to see that as part of your workflow, right? So again, if you give me 1 or 2 commits on GitHub, or if you give me commits that make no bloody sense, people do that too, eh? look, Tom, I have 50 commits, but they're all like an L, a J, nothing. Just kind of did blank commits. And I look at what they've changed. They changed nothing. They added a comment and they made a commit. No, right? That's absolutely ridiculous. And you're not going to get any bonuses for that, right? But I'm looking at for form marks for GitHub, you should have your GitHub link. In addition to that, I want to see that you're working with GitHub. So those are the places where you can lose marks. Again, it doesn't make any sense for me. Weird stuff. Like I said, if I get calculation errors in your code where it breaks, anytime any calculation breaks, I'm going to basically trounce that functionality. So remember, it's going to be like this: 2 marks for the button for UI, 2 marks for functionality for the button. No functionality or it's broken on your, like, let's say plus, 0 for that. You've lost 2 marks because your button doesn't work. And this is a calculator. Your main function doesn't work. But let's say your minus works. It's okay. I'll give you the 2 marks for that. So please be aware, excuse me, how I'm splitting that up. Okay. Any questions around how you're going to do your logic? There are some challenges from a logic perspective here, believe it or not, right? You may think that things are nice and easy, but they're not. Your other functions. Oh, one more comment. Please don't put a function to get extra marks as a button, but it doesn't do anything. The button doesn't do anything you can get 0 for. Like, I'm not going to give you extra marks for that, right? The button has to work. And if you fill in your user interface with a bunch of buttons like this, these are standard buttons, as an example, that are part of this calculator design. And I gave you kind of this as almost like our template. And these 2 buttons don't work. Take them out. I'd rather have no buttons working. Remember, it's not required to have these 2 buttons in here. You need a clear button, right? You don't need a backspace, and you don't need these 2 buttons, right? So if they don't work, leave them out. I'd rather have a space in here or a longer clear that takes up 3 button sizes than buttons that don't work. Buttons that don't work is a user interface faux pas, right? Why? That means that the user's going to try and do something and he's going to say, my calculator is not functioning. And he's right, or she's right, right? If you give a user the ability to press buttons that don't do anything or appear not to do anything, that's bad. So any questions around assignment 1? Again, I just want to reiterate, it's due next week, Tuesday night by midnight. Please don't wait to the last minute. Submit and submit often to get it done. I know that a lot of you have started. Some people have almost finished the logic behind it. That's good. If you're almost finished the logic, that's a positive. That means you're mostly there. Make sure you go through your code and it makes sense. And don't use variable names that are shortened. Don't use like BTN for button. I don't want to see that. I want to see button, right? If you're going to make those kind of things. And there's a reason for all this as we go forward. All right. Any questions around assignment 1 or lab 1? Lab 1 was the checkpoint that we did today. Assignment 1 due next week, Tuesday. We're moving on with Ionic. And I'll check Slack later on. I see there's a couple of Slack messages. I'll check it at the end if there's anything urgent. All right, so by now you should have installed and been ready with Ionic. I did my first one, right? This is this piece. And again, I did the Tabs app. I recommend that you check this out and try it out, right? Again, we're going to be talking about Angular 2. This won't be today. It will be another day where we do just Angular 2 and how it kind of functions with Ionic. It'll be kind of like a just-in-time learning for Angular 2 because we can't just focus just on Angular 2. That could take the whole semester, right? So we don't want to do that. But the idea behind Angular 2 that I want to mention quickly, that's right from the book, are the following. I want to talk about things like template. What is a template? Again, you think about an HTML file that tells Angular how to render a component. So for example, I might have a component and the template gives me a string of HTML. And that's almost like I want you to think about it as a partial file that Angular uses to structure how Angular 2 uses to structure the user interface. We do have directives, right? And what directives are slightly different. They've gotten rid of it for the most part. But a directive is usually what we want to try and do some kind of logic that's incorporated into your HTML, right? That we manipulate the document object model object, right, with some kind of something like ng4. So for a for loop or some kind of if statement that gives me a conditional HTML opportunities with that we do with Angular. And a service, this is interesting. When we create a service with Angular, We can also do things like, serve up things like JSON as opposed to, so we can have different front ends. And the back end can have a logic that connects with some kind of database, and the front end, we can serve up JSON. So the service creates that component, and we can also use it for example, for doing things like connecting to an HTTP service, the different things that you want to do. Pipes are usually used for filtering, and a pipe meaning the single pipe character that's on your keyboard, which is right above I think it's your backslash, right? Your backslash, above your backslash key, there's a pipe, if you don't know that. And usually use the pipe to separate filters. And filters, like an example would be a mount, and then currency would be the filter to kind of color your $100 to make it look like this, right? That's what the filter does. You might see the pipe in Angular 2. We're going to talk more about Angular 2 as we go, right? When we create the project, we just talked about it, we have this kind of structure. And if I look at Visual Studio Code for a second, you can see that I have all this structure that's been created for me. That's a lot of scaffolding. Look at platforms here. By default, I have iOS, right? If I don't specify the platform, it's going to install something for me. Notice that I have a bunch of stuff in iOS as well that are built in. So I can serve up iOS, or I can serve up iOS. We're going to talk about how to do that in a second. Plugins, all the Cordova plugins are right here. That's what this section means. Resources, both for Android and for iOS. Notice that there's an icon. If I look at it, you can see that it gives you the default Ionic icon. You can obviously replace these with the icons of your choice in Ionic, so that when you do your app icon, then you're good to go, right? With your icons, and everything from a extra high definition to extra high to extra high definition icon. That's what those things mean, right? And same thing when it comes to the icons for iOS. You might have different density for the icons, 2 times, 3 times, and so on, for different sizes, right? And you can replace these icon sizes with icons of your own so that they can work with multiple devices. And then again, here's the app icon itself. So those things are one, but then you have your app icon. This is the app icon that's going to appear on your device. And then a splash screen. We use a splash screen. When it links up, you'll see this. You can replace this again with an icon or an image of your own. And notice that all the icons for both iOS and Android are PNG format, which is something that we're going to be using. And if you're iOS, if you already make applications for iOS, or if you've done it before, so Jesse, he's the one guy who did pure iOS, all your icons and images should be PNG images, PNG images. And that's what the standard is for iOS. Source files. So again, you have your app source files, and notice they're in TS format. TS means TypeScript, right? So if I look at app.component.ts, you can see that this is the TypeScript code, right? And this is what Angular 2 looks like. You have some decorator called @component, right? And we point to a template URL. That's app.html. That's the template for my component, right? And then what we want to do is we want to use this component to display our application. If I look at app.html, you can see that I have something called ion nav, built a default, a new tag that I'm defining here in Angular. Angular gives us the ability to define our own custom tags in HTML, which is kind of cool, right? So here's an example of that. We have ion nav. Whenever you see ion nav, that's the navigation that we're going to use on the actual device, right? Main TS. If you look at main TS again, you can see that we're importing libraries from the Angular platform or framework, right? And that's how we bootstrap the app itself through Angular. We're going to talk about how to do that. But anything in here under app is the stuff that we're going to convert. Notice there are source. Here's a source file, right? And we're going to have a build area where it actually builds out. And usually it's inside your platform. So in iOS, you're going to go to www, and you notice that there is a Cordova.js link, as well as you might have some other platform-specific stuff on the www folder. Platform www, you're also going to have some other plugins for that piece. But anything that's under platform or iOS is going to give you information just to build things for iOS. Notice there's also a platforms.json file that gives us the latest version of the iOS build that we're going to create, which is 4.11. This is not iOS 4.11. It's the Ionic iOS version platform that we're using, 4.11. Okay. I'm just breaking out the application framework here for you. Typings. This is interesting. In order for us to take most advantage of Angular and TypeScript, right? One thing that TypeScript gives us that makes building applications easier is, like I talked about last week, is typings, and the ability for us to get code hinting and reference paths for the typings for Angular and Ionic and Cordova and jQuery and all the other libraries we're using. So when I start using those, I'm going to get code hinting right inside my editor, and that's what typings do for TypeScript. Again, very, very high level. Okay, www. Again, notice that so I got two. I got source, and then I got www. And www is actually my what it's going to look like. So here's my Ionic app. And if I skip down here, you can see how it's being used. Here's my head and body. Notice that I have a new tag called ion-app, and that's where my Ion app lives, inside these tags, right? So we use Angular to target this tag that we're going to be putting. This is where our Ionic app is going to live, right? And we have a couple of JavaScript libraries at the bottom to make sure that we enable things in Ionic. Here's one thing I don't like in the framework by default. It attaches this embedded script. And you might say, oh my God, that's bad, Tom. And sometimes what we need to do is, this is also including something called a service worker or a background worker, is what I want you to think about it as, right? And the background worker is making the use of a built-in promise, right? So when I've done registering my service worker, well, guess what? I want to do something afterwards. I want to do this. You might also see a lot of fat arrow functionalities. Last week at all? What fat arrow means? Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit today. You're going to see fat arrow everywhere in ECMAScript 2016 or 2015, as well as other places. And I want you to think about the fat arrow as almost like a Lambda function. Okay, if you know Lambda functions or from other languages like C# and Java, that's what it's kind of like. And what it looks like is this. I can rewrite this whole thing. Instead of doing open bracket, close bracket, fat arrow, I can put in function. So I can put actually a function, a callback function, and remove this piece. So it looks like this. That's what the equivalent would be, right? Which is kind of a funky way of looking at stuff, because you're looking at functions within functions within functions, and people don't like this. And also, one of the things that this has a disadvantage of is it doesn't retain scope. Back function, scope, this keyword and scope is lost, right? Because now you're inside of a new function, and a function in JavaScript is a closure, so you lose the ability for you to have lexical scope from the original calling function. And you kind of retain that, if I go back to the way it was written, with the fat arrow functions. So we're going to look at that. So fat arrow is common. You're going to see it everywhere in Node.js now, the latest versions of Node. That's where everything is being written, and it's written just like this. So what does this mean? It means, hey, give me an anonymous function that returns a console log. That's how I want you to read it, right? So anything after the fat arrow, I want you to think about it as something that the function, this anonymous function, does or returns, okay? So example, hey, I want to pass in an error parameter, okay, to this anonymous function, and it returns a console log with the error that was generated. That's how I want you to read it. Very, very simple. If you look at it like that, it doesn't give you mind-boggling problems. Like, you don't look at it and go, Cthulhu, I just got shocked, and now I'm inside of another dimension, right? Please don't look at it like that. It's just simply like, what am I passing in? If I'm passing in a value, this parameter is an error value, and I'm printing it out. And here, when I use open bracket, close bracket, means an anonymous function that's passing nothing. I'm not passing a parameter. I'm just doing an anonymous function call, right? But I'm returning the console log that says server worker installed. All right. So that's what this kind of functionality looks like. Okay, I know I'm going in detail here, but I need to, because you need to understand the structure of Ionic a little bit, so you're not afraid of it. Manifest.json kind of gives us the manifest for the Ionic app, right? In this case, the name is Ionic. Obviously, you'd want to change that. My short name would be something different. My start URL by default is index.html, but it doesn't have to be. I recommend it. It'll make it easier for you when you convert to Cordova, that's for sure, right? And notice how it references assets, images, logo, right? For my logo for the app, right? And also the sizes, the default size is 512 by 512. And it also specifies the image type as image PNG. Leave those alone. But if you want to, you can modify the logo in assets, images, logo, right? So again, if I was to look at that, and where is assets, right? Is it under resources? Where is it? I don't see it here. What would it be again? Where's your assets, images, logo? Is it under your source files, right? Yeah. Here's assets. Okay, well, where's images, logo? I don't see this images, logo stuff. Where is it? Is it here? Is it under www? Yes, could it be here, fonts or icon? I don't see that. So where is it? Is it under platforms, right? Where could it be? And that's where I want you to think about. You have to understand what this means and what the path is for this thing, right? Hooks, node modules. These are all the node modules that are included in, because it is a node application that you're building, so to speak. And now this is interesting. You have a www, and inside that you have a build folder, right? And the build folder is the final versions of main.js, right? And swtoolbox.js and so on. You're going to notice that there are some, here's main.css, here's your build folder. But what happens is with Webpack and with the services that are being used here for Ionic and Angular, when we go to our platforms, when it gets converted, it actually gets micronized. So it gets minified and uglified, if you will. And that's what happens when it converts to to an actual iOS application, right? So again, we look at the way we're going to build stuff out. Where will we do all our builds? Most likely, we're going to work with index.html, right, to kind of set together this, kind of put together a default, form or whatever, right? But a lot of our functionality on the back end, right? If you look at our source and you look at app, right? Well, app.html tells us ion nav, right? And there's other parts in here, main.ts, that bootstraps our application. Where does everything else go? And we're going to be talking about that now in the PowerPoint. Any questions around the format for our application, how it's being made? It's a little confusing at first, but notice that the main things to look at are the www folder, the source folder for how to get information about our app. And this is, when we look at the source folder, it's our app logic, right? Plugins and resources. Again, for iOS or Android, you can see that there's icons and so on, right? That's what we're using for. We need a resources folder. That is a required folder. You can't get rid of it or rename it. Please don't do that, right? That would mess up. You'd have to change your configuration files if you did that. And there is a config.xml file. This config.xml file is required by Cordova and PhoneGap and Ionic. This is actually telling you what you want to do to deploy things on iOS or Android. And right now, we only have iOS as a platform. And if we were to add Android, you would have other things in here as well. Whew, lots of work. And we'll get to it. All right, so this is what this thing does. And again, notice again, this is very different from Ionic 1 because the www folder is actually compiled to TypeScript, which is very, very important to understand, right? Okay. So Ionic 2, one thing they did get rid of was Grunt and Bower. Normally we use Bower to get, originally in Ionic 1, we used Bower to get packages that we would add into our framework. And it was like additionally 2 different tools we would need to build up our app. But we don't do that with Ionic 2. We use Ionic to get packages and platforms and everything else. So that's really, really good that they did that. I like Bower. I use Bower for almost everything when I do app development. But if there's some way of using NPM for everything, I think that's preferred. If you can use one package manager to package everything off, and I think the web is going that way when it comes to Node.js. They're trying to reduce the need for Bower and for other package managers and that kind of thing. That's good. Grunt was an automation tool. I know we use Gulp now, which is far, far better, in my opinion, than Grunt. Everyone has their opinions. But now they also use Webpack, and Webpack is like an automation tool set to automate and package up, do things like minify your files and all that kind of stuff. There's automation in the background that makes things easier for you when you run your app. Serve up your app too and do things like those kind of things. Okay, so we're going to create a Hello World app. That's what we want to do. And notice that when we're looking at platforms, we want to look at, in AngularJS, we want to look at the app.js where we have this, right? And notice that it looks at the template URL like we talked about was this build/app.html, which is the template for our application. And this is where we want to kind of put our information from our Hello World app. How do we do that, right? Now, again, one thing to note also is if we double click our index.html, it's not going to work because we need to be, and it needs to be served up by some kind of server, and the Ionic server is built in with that functionality. Okay, so help me out. If you're going to go back to Visual Studio Code in Sight Unseen, I want to kind of change what my app looks like. Can we search through this? Can you look through it yourself? Search through. I want you to let's do this exercise for about 5 minutes. I want you to search through your app structure and find out how to change stuff in Ionic. If you haven't done it already, if you're someone who've already used Ionic, it's very similar to what we've done with Ionic 1, but I want you to see where all the details are for our app. It's definitely not in platforms. This is how it gets converted, right? So chances are it's here in my index.html, right? But if it's here, and all we have in here is Ionic, a link, and this part here that shows off our Ion app, and I told you it lives in here, then it must be on the Angular side somehow, which means it's got to be somewhere. For example, inside main.js, here's main.js, and this gets converted. These are, if you notice, these are all these asterisks. These are all this has all been generated code by Webpack and by Angular. So Webpack, what it does is it takes everything together, all your JavaScript libraries, and packages them all together in one file, so it can convert it and minify it, and then make it work so it's kind of wrapped up for the different platforms, right? So it's not in here that you want to be looking, right? So what about source? Is there some place in here other than app that I've got everything? And if you look under source, there's pages. Here's my pages, and under pages you can see that I have a home page, and here it says welcome to Ionic. So this is obviously where you would change it, right? So notice that it says there's a couple of tags that are built in for Ionic. One is Ion header. This is kind of neat. I don't have to use with Ionic. This one thing that I like a lot about it compared to jQuery mobile. Notice that I don't have to use any classes here. I don't say Ion header with a class of some kind of UI, blah blah blah. I don't have to do that, right? Here, once I state Ion header, the Ionic framework understands what I'm creating. And same thing with Ion navbar. I know I'm creating a navbar with a title of home at the top, right? Here's my content from my home page. So here's my padding, and welcome to Ionic. It's all regular HTML, but I need to kind of put in Ion content. Padding is an attribute that I'm triggering. That's what I'm doing here. And then inside of here is all the stuff that I'm showing you. Here, when I put code, these code tags, it just colors this so it looks like some kind of terminal or consoleless font. That's what it's doing by default. Here's your SCSS, if you had anything interesting to put in there, and your home.ts, the TypeScript file that is the controller, if you will, or the component logic for your home page. That's what this does. Okay, and we'll get into this more later on. So that's your home page, and you can do the same thing for contacts and about. There's also a tabs navigation. So if I look at tabs, you can see what the tabs look like. Here, Ion tabs. You see that the root is tab 1 root, tab 2 root, tab 3 root. Tab title is home, about, and contact. Tab icon, you can specify an icon here and change up your tabs, right? And it looks like when I click on one of these, it's going to know what tab 1 root, tab 2 root, tab 3 root is from a link perspective, and it's going to link to that page. If I look at my tabs.ts, it does exactly that, right? One thing I don't like here in Angular, notice that it kind of casts this variable. So tab 1 root is being cast as a type of any. I don't like that. Any, when you cast something as any in TypeScript, that means you're kind of flipping TypeScript the bird and saying, I don't want to use you TypeScript. I don't know what type it is, so I'm just going to say any. Any's a bad thing, right? And hopefully they'll change that in later versions of Ionic, make it something that's, so it's not any, it's actually an HTML element that we're getting here, right? Or HTML link or something else, right? From a theming perspective, notice that you have a theme section where you can change your SCSS. Again, SCSS is compiled CSS or style sheets that include things like variables. So here's an example of a variable in SCSS where you have font path, and then it'll keep track of the font path in a variable, so you don't have to keep on specifying font path, or sorry, assets fonts everywhere. And if I look through my SCSS, I also have indications of, and again, SCSS or SAS, if you will, the colors. So here's a colors map, if you will, right? And I'm specifying primary, secondary, danger, all these different colors, and this is my theme, the default theme for my app. And you can change these here, and then the colors would change everywhere, which is kind of cool, right? Okay. I don't want to go too much more into detail here. I want you to understand where the structure is, but that's how we would build our hello world. Now I want to make it through my Ionic Creator, and Ionic Creator is a web service that we talked about, just like we talked about last week, PhoneGap Build. We talked about PhoneGap Build. For you to use Ionic Creator, I'm not going to do that today. We're going to leave that for another day. I'd have to sign up for it. So I'd have to sign up for Ionic. And then what I can do is, similar to what we did with PhoneGap Build, what you can do is you can drag and drop, this is neat, drag and drop components into your Ionic page, and it'll actually spit out your code for you. So all up online, right? Now there is a paid for version, and there are the free version, and there's different options that you get, just like anything else. But I think when you're prototyping, if I can drag and drop when I'm prototyping, hallelujah, right? If it writes some of the code for me, especially from an Angular perspective, even better, right? Remember, we want to do it when we're prototyping a hybrid application. I want to produce these as quickly as possible, and especially if it's something that a common, kind of bulk task that I'm gonna hand bomb. I'd rather have it be a drag and drop environment for those simple tasks. For functionality, you can't hand bomb. You have to kind of code your functionality. But for the user interface and the connectivity, the callback functions and all that kind of stuff, the Angular components and all your decorators and everything else, you have to do the syntax for it to be done. Again, hallelujah. I'd rather have all that done for me, right? So this is an advantage to using Ionic Creator. I have to mention that because it's a really cool service. Okay. So it kind of tells you, if you actually read this, the PowerPoint, it kind of tells you how to use Ionic Creator if you're interested in using that. And I'm not against it. Notice, just like PhoneGap Build, I can export the build depending on what format I want to kind of create. And it's really, really cool. I can export my whole application for iOS or Android, which is cool. And then it kind of tells you here how when you after you export your project, how to install it and run it locally. Okay, so I want to talk about Ionic Creator. That was my little tidbit on Ionic Creator. How about viewing my app using my web browser? What do I do, right? What I want to try and do is I want to go into my folder. We did this already, and I want to do a serve. And Ionic Serve, again, it runs this little browser in the background, and it kind of serves things up, right? So we've kind of already covered this piece. You can also do troubleshooting within your browser, and you can also select things like with Chrome Developer Tools. You can kind of select what phone you want to kind of test on. You can also test on a little mobile device. Let me show you that. So if I was going to go back to this, right, and if I was going to do the same thing I did last time, so Ionic Serve, it's going to put it into my browser for a second, really quickly, right? This little demo app. Notice that, again, it does everything. It retranspiles if there's anything to transpile, and then it puts it in inside this little mobile app. Now, to really see the effect of it, you have to kind of go this small, right? But if I open up the tools, if I go to inspect, right? So this is my tool set for Chrome. again, I'm using the Chrome tools. I'm going to pull this up for a second. You can see here on the left that I can toggle my device. If I click my device toolbar on, you can see that I can actually make it look like an iPhone, which is, it's right built into Chrome, right? So what I did with you when I went around to check your progress on assignment 1 is I'm like, okay, make it 320 by 480, right? Well, you can do that if I choose something else other than an iPhone 6, right? Or a custom, I can edit this list if I want to, but let's say I want to make a custom, view, right? I can do that. I can go to edit, right? And I can choose my emulated device, whatever device I want.
Your attention, please. The fire alarm system will be activated for C, K, B, and M buildings. Please note that this is for a real emergency and you are required to evacuate the building.
Yeah. Thank
Again,
you. Thank you very much.
In a few minutes, the fire alarm system will be activated for C, K, B, and M buildings. Please act as if this were a real emergency and you are required to evacuate the building. Thank you.
Let's go back to that. So let me go to, again, when I go to my inspector, and notice it goes right into this, right? Okay, so if you look at this, when I'm toggling in, I can toggle this on and off. So I can toggle this view. And again, these are the most common devices, right? So if I want to go to Galaxy S5, right? And as I move bigger, I mean, it's going to make it, so right now it's 10%. I can make it fit 50% of my screen or whatever. So I can see what it looks like. You can test your device in this area. Or portrait, which is really cool. And it's all built into Chrome. Like, you don't have to do a lot of work here to test out your device before it goes to a platform specific build, right? So that's kind of cool. And then again, if I want to turn it off, I don't want to see this all the time, I can always go back to this, right? So just I'm just going to stop debugging here for a second. All right, so that's one. I also want to, I'm not going to talk about this too much more. I want to kind of talk about, we're going to use the Ionic CLI, and what I want to do, notice I did this iOS sim, which it kind of, attaches the iOS simulator. And there's different things we can do. So here's iOS. How do I look for the actual platform in iOS? Well, first of all, what I need to do is if you look at the platform itself, so here, and if I look at platforms, this is my tool set. And notice that if I go under iOS, I have this Xcode project, right? Let me take a look at this. So this is actually, I'm going to bring up Xcode for a second to show you. So here's Xcode, right? I could open up my project, right? So I could go File, Open, and I could target that project. So if I go to Desktop, and if I look at this one, and I go into my platforms, and I look at iOS, I can see that there is a project here that I can open. Here's Hello Cordova. And if I open it up on iOS, it actually opens up. It actually creates an iOS application for me, a proper application, right, that I can look at, right? Notice that it needs to process the files. Now, I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think I can build it here in iOS? The answer is yeah. Huh? I should be able to do everything, right? So if I go to, this is right built with Ionic. I'm just going to choose an iPhone that's a little smaller. So we're going to go iPhone 6, right? And if I run this, right? So Command B builds, Command R runs, right? Here's my running. I'm running the thing on Xcode. Can I test it out in the simulator, right? And let's see what it looks like now. This is right in the simulator with Xcode. So I want to show you how this works. So you can use Xcode to test with. I notice that I have my Cordova app. That's the default. And then if everything works well, it's going to start in a second. And we should get some response for the actual app itself. We should. But notice that it's kind of a little bit slow. I'm still hovering on this. I am getting some debugging information down here as well. Take a look how down here is in my debugger, I get some information. This is the stuff that tells me that the app is trying to run in my simulator, right? So here's my simulator. It's trying to run, and this is my default app right now. It doesn't do anything. What was that? Yeah. Yeah, so it's looking for that, right, my start page. So why is this working like this? Well, let me show you something. If I was going to do it the other way around, if I wanted to add platform, right? If I want to add platform, I can add different platforms here. So if I go something like this, Ionic, right? And if I go add, I want you to take a look at what this does. It kind of looks through here, and it looks through my system information. It says, here's my Ionic CLI. I've already got my sim version. Here's my Mac versions, Sierra. And what I want to do is kind of install another platform, right? And we're going to talk about how to do that in a second. But interesting how you can look at things with inside my project, right? I can click onto it and I can click the run button and I should be able to see my app running in my simulator. But do I have to have my app being served up at the same time? And that's the question. Do I have to go something like Ionic serve? Here it is being served up, right? And I want to show you how this works with the other commands before we end for the day. So here it is. My Ionic app is being served. Let's kill these other iterations, right? How about now? Does this make a difference here? Like if I run this app again in my iPhone 6, will this change my resolution or change the way my app runs? And you're going to see that it doesn't really, right? So I do have an error internally for running this. That shouldn't be the case. They should run. You might get this. And the answer is don't panic because we don't need Xcode to run my app anyway. All I need is my simulator, and I want to access my simulator directly. Notice I have some extra builds. I've done this a bunch of times, right? I'll get back to this in a second. So you can open it up. All right, how about viewing my app in Android? And notice, first thing I need to do is I need to configure my environment for Android. And what they suggest you do is you download and install Android Studio and you install the SDKs that you want, right? So I'm not going to go through that process for Android Studio, but if I already have Android Studio installed, let me take a look at Android Studio for a second. And Android Studio actually it gets you to download and install standard APIs. And again, I recommend API 19 and higher you install. And if I was going to go to configure, I'm going to ignore this for a second. I'm going to go to configure. And if I was going to look at SDK manager, you can see here that these are the APIs that I have installed. I have even some earlier ones. So here's my API level 16, right? I also have API level 10. That's fine, right? But notice I definitely have 19. I don't have 20 because this is KitKat Wear. I'm not going to make a Wear app, right? So 21, 22, 23 is okay. Some of the newer ones, NuGet, I haven't installed yet. If I want to, I can. I'm not going to do that here because it takes time. We would spend the rest of the class installing SDKs. I'm not going to do that. All right. So please don't try that if it's not already done. Right. Also notice that there's an update for my whole my platform. I'm not going to do that here. And if I was going to add or do apps with Android Studio, I'd have to update my application framework because it gives me better tools to work with the stuff. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to kind of cancel out. So Android Studio has been installed. I have a certain SDKs going, and it tells you what to do to configure your apps here in Android Studio, as well as how to install your plugins. Okay, so I'm not going to go through here and how to do that. In the PowerPoint, it tells you what to do. Okay, I definitely want to run Genymotion, right? Because Genymotion is going to be my simulator, right? So I got my iOS simulator, and I want to run Genymotion, so I'm going to search for it. So again, I'm going to go to Genymotion. There it is. I did this last time. Here's Genymotion. And if you have to update it, sometimes you need to update and it kind of comes up with regular versions. I want to pull up kind of a platform that I know I'm going to be using. Notice that it says API level 17. Not sure I want to target something that low, but let's say we want to use API level 22 or 23 or something like that. This is the tablet. This is the Nexus 5. I want to use this one. And I want to click Launch Start, which is going to start my emulator. And again, the emulator is going to be inside of a VM with VirtualBox. So I recommend using the VirtualBox emulator if you're doing this kind of stuff. Even with Xamarin Forms, if you're a Xamarin person, I recommend using Genymotion. It's far, far better than using something else. Oh, Genymotion and virtual devices did not match. It's okay. I'll continue. All right, so this is my little app running on here with Genymotion. Okay, let's continue. So once I've done that, I can always I want to run the platform. So one thing I want to do, whenever you add platforms, you do it like this: Ionic, whatever the platform is, or you put platform add and then Android, or Ionic platform add iOS. Let's try that out. So if I go to this, if I stop the server, and if I go, I'm going to clear the screen for a second so you can see it. If I go Ionic platform add and then iOS, if I press that in to try and add that iOS. Now I already have iOS, but I want to show you. It's going to say platform is already added, right? Let's try the same thing for Android. Ionic platform add Android. And if you're a Windows user, you may have to do this. And if you don't have an iOS machine, that's a problem. All right, so or a Mac is what I mean. So okay, now I've added my platform for Android. If I go back here, you can see that on the Android on the platform, I have two platforms now. I have iOS and Android. They're inside of my folder structure, right? And now what I want to do is I want to run Android, right? I have Genymotion running, and what is it going to choose? Is it going to choose some basic Android Studio one? Do I have to specify my where I'm going to go? Let's check this out and see what happens, right? So if I go something like clear, and I'm just going to try to show you this. So Ionic run, and then the platform of choice. If I go Ionic run iOS, and I don't specify a some kind of default simulator, it's going to pull up the default simulator for me, and it's going to pick up the latest simulator for iOS, which is iPhone 7, right? If I don't specify. So here you can see that it's building for iOS, and it's automatically deploying. Oh, sorry, iPhone SE. iPhone SE. It tells you at the bottom what the simulator is, and that means it's going to kind of create another simulator. This is the simulator for iPhone SE. I'm just going to kind of scale it down so we can see it, right? This is built into. The only way we can test this, by the way, is if you have a Mac. If you don't have a Mac, you won't be able to run it in the simulator, and that's why we use the cloud build stuff, right? Because if you don't have a Mac, you can still build it, right, for iOS. Okay, so it's going to do the simulator stuff. Now, remember, we had a problem running it through Xcode. Are we going to have a problem running it through here? I haven't changed anything, and notice that it's deploying. It's taking its sweet time, right? What this is doing is it's actually launching an iteration or a small virtual machine equivalent, a simulator that's running the iPhone SE inside this box. Okay, and we've got nothing so far, and we've got that part, and then eventually what we should have is the application. Now it says it's going to slow down my app because that's been updated. That's okay. Don't worry about this. This is just the new way that iOS keeps track of when this was built. This is an older build, and once we start building the new stuff, it's there. But you can see how it runs right in the emulator, right? Make sense? So that's this. Let me just close down quit the simulator for a second. Let's do the same thing with Android. So if I go, again, if I do the same command, Ionic run, and instead of iOS, I put Android, and I don't specify where it's going to go, is it going to run by default in Genymotion? And the answer is, let's take a look, right? Unless I specify where it's going to go, right, as an example, it may not know where to go. I'm just going to put it out there to you. It's doing its thing. It's trying. Right? Is it running here? No, not yet. And I'm getting these dots. And this is kind of, whenever I see dots like this, guys, it's kind of troubling, but you can see how it's continuing to run. All it's doing is it's adding more dots, right? And it's filled up my screen with a bunch of dots. It's trying, is what it's trying to do. It's trying to put up to something, right? Whenever you see this, right, look, if I ever move this, watch. If I move this up, you can see that it continues to add more dots. So it's doing something. It's building something with a couple of dots in one line. But it's getting to the point where it's filling my whole screen with dots until it gets to here, right? Give me a second, right? You got to be patient. You got to be patient, right? That's why I'm doing it for you guys. I'm doing it in a safe environment that you don't, so you don't feel like you killed your machine.
Like, oh no, this is broken.
I want to stop. I want to cancel, right? You don't want to cancel. Leave it. So it's downloading some packages. Oh, build failed, and it says error. Users Thomas desktop. La 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 la. Command failed with Xcode error 1. Failure. Build failed with an exception. What went wrong? A problem occurred configuring root project Android. You have not accepted the license agreements of the following SDK platform 25. You know why this is happening? I'll tell you. Because remember that update that I just did? You saw that update in Android Studio? Those affected all the SDKs. There's probably an update for all those things, and you have to accept the license agreements. And if you don't do that because it's tried to install something for me, not going to work, right? And that's the error. So I'm not going to sit there and do it, but it would normally, if I have to specify an SDK version, I could do that. And if I kind of go further down, if I wanted to check out what it's going to look like in a specific version of Android, I would look at the documentation. So let's take a look at that really quickly and see if we can figure it out. So I want to go to Ionic, right, .io. I want to go to developers. Here's my framework docs, right? By the way, go back. Notice that they have the cloud docs, how to deploy to the cloud as well. And here's my setup and tutorial, right? If I want to look at there, it tells you how to kind of set up exactly what we've done here with version 2, right? Setup guides. Here's my next part of my tutorial. So I want to kind of deploy and start my Ionic project. And there's different, they talk about different things. Also, tutorial is another template build, if you will. I can serve it up locally. Here's it talks about the project structure, just like we did already in here, and how it works. I'm not going to go through that. Tells you how to add pages. Like Ionic is very good in terms of documentation, as you can see, how to navigate and create navigation for pages, my components, and so on. Right? Action sheets. It talks about how to make different things here. Right? These are all the components you can add on the left. Common components that you see in different application, in different frameworks, iOS or Android framework. So, example, menus. You want to make a menu, what it looks like. It gives you the kind of a quick view of what it looks like here, and code, how to make it work. Really nice and simple, which I really like about Ionic, right? Okay, how about if I want to deploy to devices? So there's iOS. Here's Android. It looks a little different, and the code will be different for this. And so multi-line items will look different, and so will menus. If I go to menus here, my menu on Android will look a little bit different than it does on iOS, right? So it tells you what it looks like. Same thing with Windows Phone. We can also have that as a target, right? Also, the great thing about, because it's so well documented, I can always do some great searches, right? And go back to this. It's neat. Yeah, I know. It's kind of neat what they came up with. But I can do some great searches here. If I go to documentation again, and I go, there's UI components, but I can also look at the API documentation, right? Here's the API documentation for doing things like doing all kinds of things, like API documentation for my fab button. How does that work? If I want to make my fab, my floating action button, which is what it is on Android, right? And other kinds of things, they'll tell you how to make all of that work. But what I'm really looking is how to deploy to Genymotion with Ionic, right? How do I do that? So I can search for that. I say, deploy to Genymotion Ionic, right? And then I'm going to look at this. This is going to come back, and they might have a solution. So Ionic emulate Android. Yeah, that's cool, right? I may also, this is not the great link, but we want to find one that tells you how to deploy everything to Genymotion. This is not it. No. But it should be, maybe my search is incorrect, but see if you guys can find it as well really quickly, because mine would work right off the cuff last time, and now of course they've updated and everything doesn't work. No, I'm not going to do that. I believe I have to update my API documentation, but I think I can specify how to specify a target emulator Ionic in motion. Figure it out. Okay, let's see if this does it. Here we go. So, okay. So we use the ADB command line. When I say ADB devices on the command, I should be able to do on the on my Android command line, I should be kind of put an ADB. Notice it does that, right? And I should be able to say ADB devices, right? And it'll give you a list of devices, right, that are running. And it says list of devices attached, ADB server version 32 doesn't match this client. That's what I have to do. I have to update my Android. That's what's stopping me, right? That's what it is, guys. It doesn't take much to figure this out, right? And this means that I have to go back into Android Studio like I failed to do, right? Here's my Android Studio. Should have done this last night. Hindsight being 2020, what it is, right? And get it done. Because if I try and do an update now, if I run this update now, if I go update, I'm going to be here until the cows come home. Even though it says my patch is 25 megabytes, it's not, right? Let's see if this works anyway. Let's hopefully it'll come up with the update. Oh, don't tell me there's a Java update too. Yeah, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time. You know, to me, I don't want to go through this. So for next week, remember I'm gonna end it here right now. We're at 10:46, 4 minutes to. For next week, what I want you guys to come up with is make sure you have your app finished by Tuesday night. Next week, we'll start a new assignment. We'll have assignment number 2 kickoff, right, with additional details. Again, we're going to be using the, look at this. We're going to be using the, 2.2 gig. That's right. That's what I was afraid of. And I'm going to say, meh, right now. I'll do that later on. Next week, we'll be starting to use Ionic throughout the process. And by next week, I'll have all this fixed, and I'll show you Jenny Motion. I was hoping that it was going to work today. Any questions around the stuff we talked about? I know it's a bit of a build and everything else, but we have to get there. And we're going to migrate from using jQuery Mobile to Ionic. Okay? Yeah, I do. Any other questions? Otherwise, guys, see you next week.